Speaking of vindicated, Nicole Saphier is here. She's a doctor and author of new book, Panic Attack, Playing Politics with Science in the Fight Against COVID-19. Dr. Saphier, how are you today?
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm feeling pretty good.
Good to talk to you. Clearly, you've been called a science denier and other terrible things, I'm sure, this last year and a half or so. Are you starting to feel a little more vindicated as the truth seems to be coming out?
Well, listen, as a full-time practicing physician, also a pragmatic individual, I've walked on a very narrow tightrope for the last 15 months, I feel. And I would never, the fact that people would say that I'm anti-science or I'm promoting conspiracy theories, it really just became quite glaringly obvious to me the politicization of everything that was occurring in the pandemic, which obviously was the impetus behind the book.
Yeah, speak to this, because I think when people think like a scientist, that like you put on the white robe or a white jacket and like all your bias goes away and you're no longer a human being. You have no human nature. You have no political biases anymore. But clearly that has not been the case. Can you talk to us about that for a minute?
Well, certainly not. I mean, hydroxychloroquine being one of the most glaring examples of just complete disruption of the normal scientific process. When I was writing about it in the book, I thought it was just going to be a couple of paragraphs. But then when I started to truly unfold the scandal that ensued, it turned into its entire chapter in itself. All it took was for President Trump to mention it at one of his famed White House press conferences, and immediately that knee-jerk anti-Trumpism just divided the country. And even though we were talking about one of the most boring, old, cheap medications that we've been using for decades with known antiviral properties, because President Trump mentioned it, it was deemed, everyone who was mentioning it was a charlatan peddling snake oil. And the white knight, Dr. Fauci, because he was discussing remdesivir, that was scientific. That was going to be the silver bullet. I mean, the truth is neither of them have really turned out to be this magical cure that we would have loved to have during the course of this pandemic. But the way that it unfolded and just the scientific scandal was a complete disaster and extremely disappointing.
Yeah. Tell us about the chapter Research Under Pressure and how I'm thinking of these epidemiologists in the very beginning who said, oh, no way did it come from a lab leak. And it's like, well, yeah, I think virologists would have an incentive to make sure that they didn't blame other virologists for the death of 500,000 Americans, right? And that's just like one example of pressure, but all these studies have certain elements of pressure to it, no?
Well, sure. I mean, what's happening right now with all of a sudden the whole conversation around the origin of the virus is mainstream media. It's not like all this new information has come out in the last couple of weeks. The truth is we've had a lot of circumstantial evidence for the last 16 months that there was potential for an accidental lab leak. I mean, there's a reason there's an entire chapter dedicated to exploring the viral origins in the book. And yet, last summer, when someone asked me about that, I said, yeah, there are a lot of strange coincidences and very random occurrences happened near that Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is only 8 miles away from the wet market where we were saying that this was an outbreak from. And if you actually look at the published literature from that lab, we know that they were working with coronaviruses. In fact, the most genetically similar coronavirus to that of SARS-CoV-2. And based on their published data, we knew that they were adding certain mutations and working with that virus to kind of change it a little bit. And a lot of those changes are in SARS-CoV-2. Now, the truth is all of those mutations can happen in nature. It's of course, most local outbreaks, epidemics, pandemics do come from that natural zoonotic spillover with animals and humans close together. But to the fact that no one was able to ask questions and to even acknowledge the coincidences that were occurring, I mean, that was criminal. And then the fact that Dr. Fauci, that's his job. I mean, he's the self-appointed infectious disease expert of our entire country. And he should have had systemic memory from dealing with the less than forthcoming China from the original SARS outbreak. Why couldn't he have pushed back a little bit more to really get some answers?
One last question about human nature, and then I want to get some numbers. We know why the media is a bunch of hacks and why they hate Trump and knee-jerk against Trump and everything he says. But what motivates these scientists, right? Like scientists are supposed to hold themselves up to the data and all this, but it just seems like they didn't. Many didn't, at least.
I would say that we're in a time of crisis, and I think a lot of people were trying to do things in haste, trying to get as much literature and data out as we could. We had hospitals overflowing. There were people dying. I mean, it was quite a terrible scene in the hospitals for people who weren't in the hospital at that time. I can tell you that was a reality. That wasn't a smoke show. And when you start doing things in haste, errors are going to be made. And, unfortunately, what we saw with the hydroxychloroquine, all of a sudden you had faulty data being used. Now, whether it was nefarious on the researchers, I probably not. I think it was negligent that they didn't actually check their data source. Also negligent on the journals to double check the data source and the whole peer review process. But because they were trying so hard to put out these pieces, mind you, these pieces that to say that hydroxychloroquine didn't work, it was really embarrassing for the entire academic community.
Let's talk about masks for a second. We did a segment the other day, and we just did 5, and there's many, many more, but 5 examples of experts pre-pandemic saying that masks are useless and they don't do anything and you shouldn't wear them. For example, we used the 2011 UK pandemic flu advisory plan. And they're like, oh yeah, we don't need to stockpile masks. Like masks don't do anything. They're not necessary for the general public. And then all of a sudden masks, of course, have become this talisman that you must wear to ward off evil COVID. What's your take on masks?
So listen, face masks certainly have their place. I mean, as a healthcare worker, I'm used to wearing face masks, not when I'm outside walking my dog alone in a park. But yeah, can face masks decrease transmission of viruses? Absolutely. Even highly contagious aerosolized viruses. It doesn't mean that they're going to contain all of it. But when we had zero line of defense against a virus, when we were in tight, close quarters and we had an inability to test people, wearing a mask wasn't a bad idea. However, they took that and they ran with that. They took it so far that they turned wearing a mask into something completely anti-science. And what we saw, because they put these restrictions forth, these mandates forth, they're having a really hard time rolling them back now, where masks are they're not necessary anymore. We have lines of defense at this point. We have reached a state of herd immunity. We are at a record low cases, low hospitalizations, low deaths. The emergency is over. It's time for us to be moving on.
Yeah. One of the amazing things I saw was, I don't know exactly when they made the change, but the WHO identified herd immunity as the number of people who are vaccinated and who have achieved natural immunity because they've gotten the virus and recovered from it, have their own antibodies and T cells. But they got rid of the natural immunity part. Now it's only people who are vaccinated. What's up with this obsession to vaccinate everyone as opposed to just the necessary number of people to achieve herd immunity?
Well, this is another glaring example of what has happened throughout the last 15 months, just the weaponization of basic immunology and concepts. I mean, herd immunity has always been when a majority of a population gets a level of immunity, not a level of population gets vaccinated, when a level of population gets immunity, that the collective herd is then protected. But because for some reason, Dr. Fauci, the CDC, and others, they're refusing to acknowledge natural immunity. And I believe, again, that is because early on in the pandemic, you heard other people talking about herd immunity. So they are starting to equate herd immunity with a conservative talking point, when the truth is it's just basic science. And to completely ignore natural immunity is the most anti-science thing you can do. And unfortunately, because you acknowledge herd immunity, that doesn't make you anti-vax. That just makes you pro-science. I would never say to the general public, we should have done herd immunity from the beginning, because as we saw, we already had almost 600,000 Americans die. If we would have not gotten this vaccine, a lot more Americans would have died. The vaccine process, Operation Warp Speed, has been the greatest accomplishment that has come from this pandemic. But it is a detriment that our officials are not recognizing herd immunity is here.
Yeah. And my last question for you is about kids and vaccinated kids. I have 4, 3, and a 1-year-old, and I'm very worried that certainly here in California, they're going to mandate you get the COVID vaccine in order to go to school. Would you recommend vaccinating kids? And just to tie it into what we just talked about, it's vaccinate whether or not your kids have antibodies or not. So it's not like, oh, you can test your kids for antibodies, and if they have it, you don't have to get vaccinated. It's going to be, you must get vaccinated. What do you think about vaccination?
Well, right. And I mean, I have 3 children of my own, and I've written on this extensively in the sense that right now we're talking, all the vaccines are through an emergency use authorization. SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 is not an emergency, our young children. The vaccine certainly should not be extended to them, in my opinion, through the EUA. You go and get your full FDA approval. I do believe that you should have a safe and efficacious vaccine for everyone. but I don't believe that you should require universal vaccination of something that is no longer an emergency, no longer a current threat the more adults get vaccinated. So I am against it. I think the current studies right now are not powered enough to see if these vaccines in the young kids are actually going to elicit the MISC that we see from the immune response following the viral infection. And until they can prove that, I'm not quite for it.
What's MISC?
That's that multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. That's the one thing that we're actually concerned with regarding this virus in kids. It's not the kids being hospitalized or dying directly from the viral infection. It's this post-viral inflammatory autoimmune response that is happening 3 to 4 weeks after infection. But that autoimmune response is because of the body's response to the virus. And the vaccine emulates the virus in the sense that it elicits the immune response. So how do we know that the children aren't going to get the MISC from the vaccine as well? That's something they're going to look for, and that's why we do clinical trials. But because it's such a rare occurrence in children who get the viral infection, they're going to have to do a long-term studies to really make sure that it's not occurring in a mass amount of kids that they decide to vaccinate.
Wow, that was deep and insightful. I want more of that. Like, subscribe, get more.